Rod Drury traces his lineage to Ngāi Tahu, speaking of the importance of tangata whenua, although that was not a huge part of his childhood growing up in Hawke's Bay. From an early interest in computer programming at Napier Boys High School, Rod studied commerce and administration at Vic, and eventually went on to found the publicly listed accounting software company Xero in 2006. He stepped down as CEO of Xero in March 2018 with the avowed goal, and a great one it is, of pursuing a range of philanthropic and social endeavours, while also remaining a non-executive director of Xero. His current passion project is to make renewable energy a competitive platform for New Zealand. He sees our water and our hills as giving us a competitive advantage in renewable energy, and in turn those renewables giving New Zealand a chance to reinvent itself. But of course there are challenges, none of which I suspect will deter this creative, visionary entrepreneur from success. To share his passion and his progress, Rod Drury, with the aptly titled, "It's Time to Think Bigger."
Good morning to you. Hi Liz. Good to meet Liz. Dee, Chris, awesome. Thanks for putting all of this together. Since I retired last year, I've been out of the media, haven't done too much of this. So you're going to get like a year of pent-out unloading. What I have been doing, I've had time to really sort of see what's going on in the world and really think about things. And there's some kind of things that some big trends that are going on throughout the world at the moment. The role of government's really changed. In the Western countries where we're burdened by democracy, you don't see a huge amount of progress, yet we're competing against countries that actually just go and get things done. What was that number about the buses? Was it 80,000 every 5 weeks? Yeah. Holy shit! When you see countries that can just make that happen, that's who we do compete against now. And the traditional alliances we have, they're all falling apart. The normal Western places that we look to aren't displaying the sort of values that we show. And I think it's time to lead. We can't just be the small brother to a bunch of other countries. We can actually do some cool stuff. And it always felt really bad that we didn't have our version of Saudi Arabian oil. We can't just pump things out of the ground and then a whole lot of good things happen from that, all the sort of money flows. We have to be a whole lot smarter. And as I was sort of looking around and had the time to think about things, we actually do have a version of Saudi Arabian oil. We have a renewable energy. And we're up to something like 86% renewable now. I mean, that's unheard of in most other countries. So I started to sort of pull the rope on that, and then some sort of thoughts started to come out. So first thing was, why aren't we 100% renewable? So I started talking to a few of the strategy people at the big energy companies, and it turns out that one of the biggest users of energy, especially coal and gas, is Fonterra. And they use coal and gas for industrial heating processes, and it costs them about $45 a unit. I can't remember exactly what the numbers were, but it's about $45 a unit for coal and gas, and electricity is about $65. So it's just not a rational decision that they'll ever flip that around. Electricity has to be down at about $30. It's just too expensive. I mean, I think one of my houses, one I do have a pool, my electricity bill is something like $1,300 or $1,400 a month, and in my apartment, which I hardly ever use, it's about $500. It's too expensive. I don't know how people actually afford it. So the thought that we have hydroelectricity, it should be pretty cheap to make. It's just water, and yet it's still really expensive. So we need to dramatically step down the price of electricity. And if you step the price of electricity down, like majorly, then everything flips across. Industrial heating moves, obviously energy, transport moves, all those sort of things start to move. So then you start pulling the rope a bit more. Why is electricity so expensive? And what I found out was we only store 8 weeks worth of water. It's like, what? Why don't we store 3 years worth of water? And it's because we stopped building dams. So, and then you look at, okay, well, why did we stop building dams? Well, the reason we did that is because we have these other strong values in New Zealand, which are quite different to other countries. The environment is obviously very important. Equality is also important, but we just can't even have a conversation about doing dams anymore. And that seems crazy, because that is our competitive advantage. So, so I started thinking about, well, why don't we build dams anymore? And then because the people that are green and want those things also want these really big outcomes. So I think what's changed now is technology is making the business case for the things that we want really, really clear. Electric vehicles are one example, and they're things that people get excited about. And in fact, one of the podcasts that got me really into this, the electric vehicle podcast, I heard the interview with Dr. Rod, and talking about electric aviation. And that sounds super exciting. And again, you think about, and what I didn't understand was that we're just starting to cross some thresholds where electric aviation is becoming viable for commercial. And then you put that in a New Zealand context. Why is that interesting? Well, it's interesting because 100% of our domestic network is incredibly short haul. Like if you're doing electric planes in Finland, it's sitting next to an A380, it's not that interesting. But in New Zealand, we could actually have a vision, say in 15 years, where we say, we're going to go 100% domestic aviation. And how does New Zealand love that? Well, first of all, you can get to Queenstown, you know, for maybe about $30-40 because the fuel becomes cheap, but also there's no carbon. So that's really exciting. So we can actually, you know, quite uniquely, because of our small island nation, say electric aviation is something we're going to get really excited about. So you start thinking, okay, that's the things that we want. Are we going to then have a mature discussion about sacrificing a small amount of land and actually storing lots of water? And talking to the energy companies, when I first came in, they said, oh, you're a computer guy, you're going to say, let's have a whole lot of Tesla batteries. And I was like, no. The best battery of all is a lake. You know, it's essentially free. And so I've been thinking about it, why don't we go really big? If we want to make a step change and dramatically reduce the price of electricity and then build a whole lot of new industry around using clean, cheap energy, that's super exciting. So then you take the aluminium smelter down the South Island, right? It was interesting in the last presentation because after the VW emissions crisis, everybody wants to have electric vehicles. You know, all the big investors are now building electric cars. But the next question becomes, how did you make your cars? Well, we made our cars with aluminum panels made from renewable energy. That's super exciting. And it's a good example of how you can actually embed renewable energy in a whole lot of products. So clean manufacturing becomes our competitive advantage. If we can drop the price of electricity and then build industries that build things, we get to export electricity in all these products. And that's super exciting. So then you go, okay, well, how do you pay for this stuff? And then so I've spent a lot of time in the Australian industry. We're an ASX 100 company now, so you get to meet all the big super funds. So the Australian super, because they've had compulsory savings, now has $2 trillion. And they need to place that money and to put that money to work. And what's interesting is they normally give that money up to fund managers who invest in Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Alibaba, Apple, all the companies that don't pay tax domestically and also are creating short-term employment issues. So the Australian super funds are desperate to deploy capital locally, but they don't have big things to invest in. And infrastructure is perfect. So the Aussies, if they could get 3 or 4% on their money, they'd be right into it. And if you're building things like big infrastructure, big dams, that's the best thing because the cost of electricity becomes the cost of basically the cost of capital for building a massive infrastructure project. And because there's no marginal cost of water, the more water that runs through it, the cheaper electricity becomes. So essentially, we now have, it's never been a better time to go and raise $10 billion and build some massive new bits of storage structure, which allow us then to massively increase the supply of electricity and then increase the demand of electricity by a whole lot of these really new cool things that we can all get excited about. And the problem, what I've seen is that you'll never see this vision from politicians. It just doesn't work that much anymore. It's not, you can't ask the government for everything. What we've got to do as an industry is actually put it all together. Here's the money. Here's the advocates that are saying this is the demand side. and we're sensitive to the issues. There's people that own shares in the gentailers, so we need to move the supply and demand curves so that they can still pull their few billion of dividends out there. But we also get to invest in all this new infrastructure, which is pretty exciting. So what does that mean? Maybe we should build some dams. I don't even know where they go. I don't care. There'll be other experts that do that. It'd be ideal if we can do stuff in the North Island. That would be great. Maybe it's just big ones in the South Island. But once that investment happens, you start building a really strong grid. Once investment flows into the infrastructure, more investment flows into the grid and all of those good things. So, I think we can line all of those things up. So what I've been doing is going around talking to the Green politicians, had a huge amount of fun doing it. And, James Shaw sort of gets it pretty quickly. Everyone said that Eugenie Sage would be the hardest. She's hilarious. And she was really clever. And we've had a good open conversation. If we want all these good things, then we need to make a really good decision, or we can have at least a debate about whether we do some big infrastructure. And it also seems these days, if you're storing a massive amount of water, then you can do all sorts of cool things. You can clean rivers, you can manage water, you can do more plant-based proteins, all those really good things, and have really good water skiing rates. Electric fours, of course, now. So all of that, I've been going around talking to boards, talking to the politicians, and everyone seems to think, well, so far no one said it's really stupid, and it seems actually quite possible. So what I was excited about today was to actually have a broader conversation, start the conversation, but why don't we just go for it? Build some big infrastructure, raise some big money, and actually have a goal of, why don't we be trying to get electricity down to 10% of the price? Should be almost free. It's just it's just the cost of infrastructure, and the more units we use, exporting clean products made from renewable electricity, we're in a really exciting place. Anyway, it's a starter for 10. Anyone got any thoughts?
And Rod, we will take questions for Philippe. We didn't have time, but we will have time to question Philippe later. Rod, does wind excite you as much as the water too? Because if that was built up to scale, perhaps without...
No, wind doesn't excite me at all. Solar doesn't excite me at all for a few reasons. One, it's marginal, and it's only turned on a while. And if you've got lots of water, which you can turn on straight away, and you've got certainty of supply, that's just marginal stuff. I think it's a waste of time if we can do water properly. We don't have a competitive advantage in wind or solar. Like Aussie's going to do solar better than we do, and you've still got to build all this infrastructure, and sometimes it doesn't work. Water is the best storage system, and also I don't like the thought of what happened in California, where you pull people off the grid. If you pull people off the grid, the rich people leave, and you're left with poor people who are splitting the cost by less and less. So much better for us to have a strong centralised system, and really go for a massive water storage. There may be some interim stuff that we do around the edges, but to me it's a waste of time unless we should be doing water really well, because that's a competitive advantage.
It's radical. Damon Gameau had his film 2040, which you might have seen showing in India. They're all getting off into individualised solar panelling and making villages and getting off centralisation.
Yep.
But all of these ideas are what we're here to discuss.
Yeah. And I know that's a bit controversial. The only real risk, I hope you guys have all seen the Bill Gates documentary on Netflix, that's super interesting. The only real risk of doing big hydro is if nuclear suddenly becomes fashionable and they solve the problems. And that's really interesting. That to me would be the only real threat to doing big hydro. But I think in New Zealand, there's some conversation we're just not going to have, so nuclear isn't going to be there. Though it is interesting that Huntly does it like a nuclear reactor already. So, but
I don't know. In the female DNA of New Zealanders, I don't think nuclear will ever pass.
Exactly. So big lakes.
Yeah. Anybody else with questions? I'll come down and we'll just. Excuse me. Lovely to have this sort of exchange of ideas. The essence of the korero. Just your name and organisation.
Great. Hi Rod, I'm Danuta Bibik. I'm Head of New Ventures at Transpower, so really excited to engage broadly on, so I think Rod raises a great question around how do we create capacity in the future, and with the energy, water, food nexus, New Zealand as a low carbon electricity environment could be great. In your thinking, have you looked at any distinctions between pumped hydro, so using the dams we've got differently, versus building new dams?
Sure. So pumped hydro makes a whole lot of sense. But again, it's a marginal thing, and there's arbitrage there, so it's not clean and pure. So I think it could be an interim thing, and people smarter than me will work out what the mix of that is, because that may be we don't need to do some more stuff, but it just feels more like an arbitrage opportunity. You know, far better is storing water, because I think the benefits of storing water, especially with climate change, having a strong water storage environment gives you so much more certainty over a whole lot of other things. It's a very stable way to hold energy. So, you know, we're only talking probably about $10 billion for another major dam project, and that's pretty small when you look at how much money is available for infrastructure. The problem with the industry, though, is that there's no big reward for making a radical change. So, you know, it's all okay, it's all marginal, but it's marginal around prices up here. We've got to actually now have a conversation. How do we drive prices down to here? And that's about being bold. And I think that's something that all New Zealanders get behind. And the time is now, because we can now see through tech the things that we want. And it is really quite enjoyable having the discussions with those really arch green people who are passionate Kiwis and saying, okay, well, you can't run away from the trade-off. You know, if you want that, we've got to think about that. And is that bad? And that's a really interesting discussion to have.
Thank you, Rod. I'm Arturo. I'm independent researcher, and I do consulting to boards. Just a question on the methane buildup. If you think of building new hydro, it's going to build up methane, and we don't necessarily know how much that happens. And also Taupo supervolcano, that seems to be a good battery already there. So what are your thoughts on the geothermal side of Taupo? And
well, people smarter than me would know that geothermal is probably the best if you can get it. I don't know why we're not doing it. I just don't know. I've really been focused on hydro and as to methane. I don't really know that. Other people will know. So these are the sort of things I'd like to understand a bit more, so I can see what the arguments for not doing it would be. I just don't know yet.
Hi Rod, Steve West, Charge New Zealand.
Oh, sorry, buddy. Why did I say Chris? Oh, because Chris said at First New Zealand Capital. I was just talking to him. Sorry. Just as you get old, your brain gets addled.
So you're talking about a radical drop in the price of electricity, and the first thing that occurs to me is, well, there's a bunch of players in the industry, and they all that's how they make their living. They generate and transmit and distribute and retail electricity. And if you're talking about halving the cost of electricity or a quarter or a tenth, then that's a lot of people that are going to be upset. Is this, that sounds like a big political problem to disrupt such an entrenched industry.
Yeah, and that's the point is we have to have that conversation, and we have to have a disruptive conversation, or nothing will happen, and it'll just be incremental. So the idea is to have that big conversation, but I was careful when I was talking that we've got to build both the supply and demand side. So this isn't a two-sided thing, and if you have both, then it's just following those economic curves. So if there's a few billion of dividends being paid out, you have to think there's at least that in increasing both supply and demand. And I think that's something we've got to engineer to help those firms transition. Or, what can happen is what's happening in the auto industry at the moment is someone just does come in and disrupt. You can't feel bad about that. But I think, from a New Zealand point of view, we'll be very aware of all of the issues, get them all on the table, and then we're all smart, we'll scramble the pieces together, and boom, there's the plan. And it won't come from government, it can only come from us. At best you can get government to think, okay, right, this will fit into our strategy. And that's the process of having those conversations.
One last question.
Nick with Meridian Energy. It only seemed fair that I'd ask a question carefully. Look, there's a couple of people I'd love to connect you with in the business, but one of the things we've tried to do is consent new hydro in the South Island and other schemes around New Zealand. But of course, RMA and other interests have been the determinants to not be able to put those ahead, so we would be building those today. So how do we have that reasonable conversation with those people, and how do we have that reasonable conversation in light of the RMA so we can achieve some of these great visions that you have?
Yeah, so there's two answers to that, which I'll give. The second one is a lot longer, so I won't say it. So there's the facade of a process. The first one is, let's be a bit more North Korean and just say, this is what we're doing, it's good for the country, have a bit of backbone, do a bit of a consultation, but we're doing it. And that's what happened in the old days, and we're too scared to have those conversations. So You know, if we can get but to do that, you've got to have the vision of the demand side of all the cool things that people want, and if people can sign up for that vision, then you can have a conversation about you know, sacrificing a bit of land and resource issues. But we got a lot of land in New Zealand. You know, you fly down the South Island, there's a lot. So can we take a small amount of that? And it's going to be awesome. I'll buy a batch on the lakefront. It'll be freaking awesome. Cool. You know?
Thank you very much, Rod. I'm already sensing you lining up the Bible. And I do recommend that film. It just reminded me when he was speaking, 2040 by Damon Gameau. You can stream it. It's got interesting ideas as well. But your lineage is also rooted in Muldoon, Rod. That's interesting. It's time to think bigger. And Muldoon did do that, and he did drive things forward. Whether you like it or not, he made change. And today is about making change. So thank you so much.